Hey guys, this is your host Nitin Binhani, and a very warm welcome to my startup podcast channel Jazair Audio, where we share real stories with real learnings. My guest today is Mark Nadal, the founder CEO of Era Incorporate. It is an innovation lab that is striving to bring a fully secure, decentralized internet infrastructure as well as its applications that have been created with an open source mindset. And Mark recently raised his angel round of $2.7 million from the marquee investors like Tim Draper and Mark Benioff. And in this podcast, Mark will threadbare some of the non-obvious insights on the angel investors, and he also shares some advice for the founders who are in fundraising mode. So let's welcome our today's special guest. Hi Mark, welcome to Jazair Audio and thank you for talking to us.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
So if you can start with a brief about you and your venture Era.
Yeah, so I am Mark Nadal, and I run Era, and Era builds a bunch of tools for nonprofits that are trying to make internet a better place. So one of the most important initiatives that we're working on is building cybersecurity infrastructure to add end-to-end encryption to pretty much any website or any app that you use. And another piece is building low-level developer tools for engineers to create experiences that wind up being decentralized. They're not controlled by any monopoly like Facebook or Google or Apple or Amazon. So those are just a couple of the pieces that we're working on. That's very low level to the internet itself, but it's helping improve the health of the internet to make for a more free and open and inclusive internet moving.
And what has been your fundraising experience?
Yeah, so I've raised $2.7 million, and there's a lot of interesting tricks to fundraising. So my route was the slow path. I started in high school trying to first talk to local business association, chambers of commerce, and that went nowhere. And one of my friends I was fortunate enough to have stated, hey, you should really look in Silicon Valley, and a venture capital investor got included in being aware of that. And we started doing some online pitches for our startup back then that we were running out of high school. And we won a pitch Kaufman found, which was a small amount of money that took us pretty far, and that 2 years later got us accepted a accelerator program that CLA had. So we then attended that, and then a few years later, an accelerator in Silicon Valley called Boost out to us because the founder of Adam Draper, son of billionaire Tim Draper, who is very big on Bitcoin, Tesla, Elon Musk. So his son reached out to us because he had gone and they were looking for company accelerator. And because we had gone through the LA accelerator, they had found us from that route. We got accepted. And then from Boost, I got to pitch Tim Draper himself at this. But we wound up raising from Tim Draper, who then referred me later to another billionaire, Mark Benioff of Sales, and then several other smaller venture capital firms and investors followed as a result of Draper.
So, what were the key mistakes you think you made during the fundraising journey, and what were the learnings from them?
Yeah, so the biggest mistake is thinking that investors care about what they talk about. Some do. The good investors, like Tim Draper, are honest. They actually seem to follow through on the things they talk about. But it seems like the majority of venture capitalists, and I have to be careful because any venture capitalist could be listening to this, a lot of them are playing the game themselves, right? They're trying to one up their own career. They're either coming out of being investment bankers or an MBA at some university. And that means you have to align yourself with their interests. And their interests are not necessarily the same that you as a founder might hope they would. Now, what's interesting is what universally gets preached about is team, tech, and traction. That if you have an incredible team with some really awesome traction that's happening on your company with some innovative tech, that you're going to be able to raise money. And I hope that's true. But I have found that it seems more related to who you know than what your team is or your technology is or what your traction. So we had incredible traction, and I have raised money, but I don't think I've really raised money as a result of having traction. We at one point hit like 107% monthly growth. Over the last 6 years, we've gone from the very first month, a few hundred downloads, to having about 30 million downloads 2020 alone. So our growth vector has been incredible. But I don't want to deceive anybody in saying that, oh, if you then have this amazing team, we do pretty incredible names that are with us, as well as this incredible traction, that you're going to somehow get investment. It's not, I wish it was that simple. And I do wish that is the decision that they made, but it seems to relate more to how well you've buddied up with people in Silicon Valley or in the community. Now with COVID, everything's international. So I don't know how that's changing, but it does seem to be more tribal than it is really about merit. So one of the things that I didn't talk about earlier is then going into a meeting and talking about an incredible team or traction. It seems like the more talking you do in an investor meeting is equally proportional to not raising money with that investor. Because I was so excited about the team and the traction, the tech that we had, I just was passionately talking about that. And that did not seem to result in of 200 VCs that I've pitched to. I've only raised from a handful of them. So talking about your passion may not be the right strategy, at least in my experience. It seems like there's very few investors that you can talk about things passionately with that actually genuinely care and see you for that. Now, that could mean that that is your only vector that you should chase, that you should just unabashed passionate. And, it might take you hundreds of these that you're talking to that, one latches onto that passion. But my understanding is a lot of other companies that I've talked to have raised more money than me on fewer pitches. And so that's indicate to me that there's more of a game to it than being passionate about your team or your technology or your traction. Because that was what got me excited. And I thought it would get venture capitalists as well. So now the next kind of mistakes that I can talk about are getting into actually negotiating deals. I have found that of the 2.7 million that I've raised, probably more than 2 million of that came in less than 2 meetings. So, which is pretty shocking. Now, I need to differentiate. That's across 2 rounds. And so some of my investors from my first round, some of them also participated in my second round, in which case, of course, that's another meeting with them, and that's the majority of the money. But those same investors in my first round invested within 2 meetings. Other investors that I had term sheets from for 2 million as well dragged meetings on for months. And I told them that after 2 months of negotiating, that their deal wasn't as good as what some of my earlier investors reckoned that I take. And so I came back and said, hey, my current investors are not happy with these terms. And, no offense, Tim Draper is a legendary investor. So I trust him when he says, and I told them, no, you need to either up the deal or I'm going to walk. And they wound up saying, okay, walk. And I did. And that was very hard to do when there was $2.1 million on the table. But I'm very glad that I did that. So my tip here, this is now at the stage you already have term sheet, you already have investment commitment, and you're still trying to figure out whether you're going to close on the money. It does seem like the longer a venture capitalist or investor drags their feet, the less likely they're done. So the majority of my money in 2 meetings.
These are amazing insights and learnings, Mark. Does that mean that if you are well connected with some of the renowned VCs or you have some common connection with them, you will eventually get funded sooner or later?
It's the last thing anybody wants to hear. I have spent the last, 6 years building up connections and friends, and I've lived in the Bay Area for the last year. And even with those sorts of connections, you're not necessarily guaranteed to raise. So even if you do have a friend who is successful and refers you to another VC, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will raise either. I'm just kind of being the sad doomsday speaker to say that a lot of the things people talk about as what you need to have to raise does not match with the companies who have raised the most. And a lot of the things that you might need to have to raise the most doesn't necessarily guarantee you raising any at all. So, what that then means is don't get disappointed whether you've been doing this for years or for a few months, whether you've played the game or not. What matters more is to turn your focus on the problem that you're solving and figure out how to be sustainable from here onwards out into the future, regardless of whether you fundraise or not. And this starts to put you in a position of leverage or power that, hey, if you're able to control your own destiny and your own progress and your own success, then you're already going to automatically be more attractive to investors in the first place. Again, doesn't mean that you're going to raise money, but being in control of your own finances just takes a lot of stress and pressure off of you in the first place.
And in your experience, what were the differentiating factors between those who invested in you and those who just dragged along the way but eventually they didn't invest?
Yeah, two things. A lot of the investments were follow-ons, which is after I closed Tim Draper, a bunch of other firms were like, hey, can we invest also in the round? And that's effectively them saying, we trust what Tim Draper does, and they might do their own due diligence, but depending upon how long that goes on is probably an indication that they're not invest. So a lot of that, I shouldn't say a lot, some of the money is that people just saw Tim Draper and Mark Benioff invested, and so they followed right away. They didn't really ask too many questions. So that's probably going to be the majority of what you see in terms of follow-on finance. They trust some other investor and then they just want to jump in. However, then the question is, how do you get that first investor, right? It is also true that the first investor that did the largest amount of money invested, and that was Tim Draper as well as Mark Benioff, as well as Nirvana Capital. They were fast. They made their decision effective. And that's very appreciated of founder. So Tim is getting to review us after his son's accelerator Boost VC demo day. So there is certainly an amount of trust that I won just going to the accelerators and then getting screened by Tim that I don't want to ignore, because had I just blind pitched Tim, things might have been different. The third thing that I wanted to talk about was around Tim's decision making, regardless of my story there, unique, as well as the other ones that invested quickly. And I think that's because when they talk about being founder friendly, they genuinely mean it. Pretty much every investor you're going to talk to is going to claim that they're founder. But there seems to be very few, right? That handful of investors that do seem to recognize you uniquely as a person for your grit, your insight, your quirk, your determination, your hard work, your effort, and they seem to care less about the idea or the product. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't care about the technology and product. They do, but my observation is they seem to have an uncanny ability to identify who is a founder that is doing this genuinely because they care about passion. They seem to recognize that passion and match it up with the determination and grit and perseverance. So they seem to identify founders for their founder's sake, their personality. And then, of course, they're happy that the product or the technology, the traction is there. But I would say for the set of investors that invest very quickly, it's more about recognizing the founder as a person, regardless of anything else.
And finally, what would you advise to those founders who are currently in the fundraising mode?
Yeah. First, focus your time on your product and get the traction and the technology there. Second, talk about it widely, publicly, openly. Third, network with other founders as much as possible. Fourth, use that network to founders who've already gotten successful exits and have made existing capitalists happy. Fifth, be genuine friends with them. And, if you need be, just outright say, hey, I want to be part of your network. I want to get to know you. I want to hit you up for connections that you have and investors that you have. And I also want to podcast you. I also want to send you updates and get critique back from you. And how can I help you in ways? Be genuine, be straightforward about moving forward, but also build up the network. And then six, when the time is right, when you are hitting an inflection point with your growth from the first point and you hold all the cards and leverage in your power, then say, hey, I am trying to fundraise now. Can you refer me investors?
So, with this, we have reached at the end of this podcast. Mark, it was a pleasure to have you on Desire Audio, and thank you for sharing great insights with us.
Yeah, happy to help. And anybody listening, reach out to me on Twitter at Mark Nadal, MarkNadal. My DMs are open and happy to help as much as I can.
Are you a founder of an early stage startup and looking to raise funding? Get your startup investor ready before even you start pitching to your prospective investors. For know-how, please visit www.jazaro.in. That is www.jasaro.in.
Lastly, I want to thank all the listeners who took their valuable time to listen to this podcast. Keep rocking, be safe, and don't forget to share.